Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with Professor Joseph Francois, Managing Director of the World Trade Institute of the University of Bern. Welcome, Joe. I'm very pleased to have you here. Joe Francois will give a talk in the next workshop of the Italian Trade Study Group. And the talk will be on trade and climate policy in general equilibrium, a very up-to-date topic. Joe, how are trade and climate policy related?
In complicated ways, and indeed in ways that make it hard for us to analyze them, right? So part of what I'll talk about then is how these the linkages. So global value chains matter. There are cross-border linkages. So when something happens between two countries, you may have effects in third countries. It also means that making commitments inside your own borders don't do it because of cross-border linkages. Okay, so what can happen then is trade lets you outsource emissions. Firms then have incentives to do things that maybe we didn't mean for them to do. And so, yeah, so trade basically makes the whole policy problem harder. Or from our perspective, it makes it more interesting.
Of course.
Yeah.
I know you've been working a lot on general equilibrium models. So you're an expert really in this field. What are the key messages coming from this general equilibrium perspective on trade and climate policy?
Yes, so part of it is that we have another set of tools, which is multi-region input-output analysis, which in non-technical terms means we work with data looking at cross-border value chains. And the data that we use in CGE models is basically the same data that you can use to do MRIO analysis. And they seem to be complementary in the sense that you can identify ex ante or before you structure an agreement, which sectors might have the most impact, right? Not just in terms, say, of, let's say carbon embodied in exports of steel, but also, which sectors are tied to that or which other countries are tied to that. And so where in the past we would have used CG models primarily to look at the economic effects of a trade agreement, and separately they're used for climate projections. But it looks like we can look at these more complex linkages, try to identify unintended effects ahead of time, and it just gives a richer sense of what's happening, what the climate impacts are. And I mentioned carbon, but it could be it could be water, it could be rainforests that are going into production. There's a number of other relationships we can use that combines the modeling work with the MRO analysis. So.
Very interesting. In your model, I suppose that there is room also for understanding which role the European Union plays in this context. The European Union is considered a champion in environmental policies compared to other countries. Is this really the case? What do data say about this? What do you think?
Okay, and so here I'm actually going to pitch a project that's been running at EUI in Florence, which we've been tied into, where we are looking at the effect of what are called non-trade policy objectives in trade agreements, specifically for the EU, and to what extent that works. Do we get effects or not? And you have to distinguish, I think, between well-intended or good intentions versus actual outcomes. And there's not strong evidence of actual outcomes at this point, partly because I think we didn't understand how strong the relationships are. We have seen recently with the Swiss agreement with Indonesia, or the EFTA agreement with Indonesia, for example, putting in requirements on sustainability of palm oil use. We are seeing which sectors tend to be more sensitive. So in the case of the EU with Mercosur, modeling has identified how important the treatment of beef really is, right? So beef, it turns out, is a macro issue in an environmental sense because of the methane effects. And so the mundane thing about quotas versus tariffs and the volumes of trade that are allowed start to matter there. right? And this shows up in the modeling. The commission, yeah, yes, they've been pioneering in terms of trying to put these things into agreements and ensuring that they're addressed. But I don't think we've had a good understanding before of what would work and what didn't. And again, back to this, flanking the CGE work. So just looking at past agreements and seeing what's happened, it has been really informative.
Thank you very much. One last point, you mentioned trade agreements and preferential trade agreements that are now sometimes including climate and environmental issues. But we know that at least from a theoretical perspective, for trade policy, multilateralism should be superior to preferential trade agreements. Is it the same as far as environmental and climate policy are concerned? What do you think?
Yeah. So, no, wait. Yeah. The short answer is I agree. The longer answer is actually, if you look at this and you think about the policy tools that you might want to use, the fact that we have cross-border linkages between economies and firms means that national policy alone won't work. Right. It also means that it's not just trade agreements. We actually have to revisit, I think, tax treaties, right? Because you're talking about to have effective policies that have, let's say we're not raising taxes, but we're rebalancing the tax system to have things that are incentive compatible in terms of the outcomes that we'd like, right? You don't want to subsidize activities that are damaging the global commons, for example. But that means that you probably have to introduce taxes that were not contemplated with existing treaties within the OECD and such. In addition, it may mean that we have to piggyback on top of VAT systems. So there's all kinds of public finance things in addition to the trade policy, in addition to the climate policy, to get it to work. Just because I work in an institute where I'm surrounded by lawyers, and we have to worry about the rules and the way the system is run and governed, and whether it's plurilaterals or multilaterals or some other thing that's not quite bilateral. All of those hinge on implementation and on how the rules are done. And we're looking at a problem where it's a multilateral problem, which means we need to have cross-border tools, but it also means we need to have the frameworks that legally let. You don't want to have a case where you figure out some tool that really works and then firms just sue left, right, up, down, and sideways to prevent it from being implemented, right? So what it does mean is that we economists are identifying that the lawyers have to be busy. That's how I put it.
Thank you so much. I think this is very interesting, and we definitely look forward to your talk during the workshop. Thank you so much.